There is a black stone sitting in a museum in Jordan. It is not as tall as a man, but large enough to feel like a presence, large enough that when you stand in front of it, you understand why the king who ordered it chose stone instead of papyrus. He wanted this to last, carved into its surface, in letters that scholars recognize as one of the most important ancient inscriptions from the language world of the Bible, close kin to the Hebrew that Israel's own scribes were writing at the same time, in the same region, about the same events. Is a story, not Israel's story, Moab's story. In 1868, a German missionary named Frederick Augustus Klein was traveling through the highlands east of the Dead Sea. A local man led him to a flat field outside a ruined city, and there, half buried in the earth, was the stone. Klein could not read it, but he knew what he was looking at. A paper impression was made of the surface before anything else could happen, preserving parts of the text that what came next would try to take away. Because what came next was chaos. European scholars rushed to acquire the stone. Local people, sensing its value, broke it apart. Fragments were scattered, sold, and eventually recovered. The paper impression filled in what the breaking had tried to erase. The stone is now called the Mesha stele, named after the king who ordered it carved, sometime in the 9th century before Christ. And on it, a king of Moab speaks. He does not speak as a villain. He does not speak as a footnote in someone else's history. He speaks as a king who won his land back, who built his cities, who served his God, and who had his own version of every event the Bible describes from the other side of the border. For centuries, the world knew Moab through Israel's eyes. Here was Moab, speaking back. So who were they? Where did they come from? Why does the Bible return to them again and again, across more than 1,000 years of history, calling them enemies, warning Israel away from them, judging them through its greatest prophets, and yet never quite letting them go? And why, after all the curses and wars and scandals and silences, did God refuse to erase them from the story? That is what we are here to find out. Chapter 1. A nation born in the dark. There is a cave somewhere in the hills above Zoar. We do not know exactly where it is. The text does not give us coordinates precise enough to find it today. What the text gives us is what happened inside it. And what happened inside it is one of the most uncomfortable origin stories in the entire Bible. But before we go into the cave, we have to understand what had just happened outside it. Sodom is gone, not defeated, not occupied, gone. The city that Lot had chosen when he and his uncle Abraham parted ways. The city that sat in the well-watered plain of the Jordan and looked, from a distance, like the garden of God, had been reduced to smoke and ash overnight. Lot's wife had looked back and become a pillar of salt. Everything Lot had built in that city, his home, his standing, his sons-in-law who laughed when he warned them to leave, all of it was gone. Lot and his 2 daughters had made it out. Barely. They were supposed to flee to a small city called Zoar. But Lot was afraid to stay even there. So they left Zoar and went up into the hills and found a cave. And they lived in it. Now stop and sit with that for a moment. These are not people making comfortable choices. These are people who have lost everything in a single night. The world they knew. The city they called home. The people they loved who did not listen. All of it was ash. And from where they stood at the mouth of that cave, looking out over the valley, there was nothing. No city, no neighbors, no future they could see clearly enough to plan toward. The older daughter spoke to the younger one. She said something that reveals exactly how completely she believed the world had ended. She said their father was old. She said there was no man left on earth to come to them in the way of all the world. She was not being dramatic. She genuinely believed. In that moment, looking at the destruction below them, that what had happened to Sodom had happened everywhere, that they were the last people, that if humanity was going to continue, it would have to continue through them, with what they had. What they had was their father. What happened next? The text records, without flinching and without commentary. The older daughter gave her father wine until he did not know what he was doing, and she lay with him. The next night, the younger daughter did the same. Both daughters conceived. The older daughter's son was named Moab, which in Hebrew sounds like the phrase meaning from the father. She did not choose a name that meant hope or new beginning or something forward-looking. She chose a name that pointed directly backward, to the cave, to the wine, to the night the world seemed to end. His name meant exactly what it meant. Now here is the question that the text does not ask, but that every careful reader eventually has to sit with. Was this sin? The answer is less simple than it first appears. The text never calls it sin. Not directly. There is no divine judgment pronounced over Lot or his daughters. There is no angel appearing afterward to condemn or correct. The story is told with the flat, documentary patience of a narrator who wants you to see what happened and draw your own conclusions. What we know is what the daughters believed. They believed they were acting out of necessity. They believed the alternative was the end of everything. In a world where a woman's survival depended entirely on the protection of a male relative, and where that male relative was old and the world appeared to have been destroyed. Their calculation had a terrible logic to it. They were not acting from desire. They were acting from despair. And from that despair, a nation was born. Moab entered history not with a conquest, not with a covenant, not with a promise from God or a dramatic calling under the stars. Moab entered history in a cave, in the dark, from the wreckage of Sodom, through the decision of a woman who thought the world had ended and was trying to make sure something survived it. That is the beginning. And beginnings matter in the ancient world in a way that is difficult for modern people to fully feel. In a culture where lineage was destiny, where the story of your ancestors was the story of who you were. The origin of Moab was something every Moabite carried, not as guilt necessarily, not as shame that each individual person felt personally, but as the shadow that the beginning of a story casts over everything that comes after it. The question that Moab's existence raises, from the very first generation, is whether origin defines destiny, whether the cave has the final word. The answer to that question will take more than 1,000 years to arrive. And when it does, it will arrive, not through a king or a warrior or a prophet. It will arrive through a woman standing in a field of barley, choosing to go where she has no obligation to go, stay where she has no reason to stay, and belong to a people who have every legal right to turn her away. But that is later. For now, Moab is a child in a cave, named for what he came from, not for what he might become. And from that beginning, a people grew. They grew in the highlands east of the Dead Sea, in a land that was, despite everything, genuinely good. The Moabite plateau sat at an elevation that gave it rainfall other parts of the region did not receive. The soil was fertile. Grain grew. Cattle grazed. The land could support a population. And over the generations that followed, it did. This is something that tends to get lost when we read Moab only through the lens of its origin story. The land of Moab was not a wasteland. It was not the kind of desolate place you exile people to. It was a place worth living in, worth fighting for, worth building a kingdom on. And Moab built one. They were not the wandering remnant of a disaster forever defined by one night in a cave. They became farmers, herdsmen, traders, soldiers, kings. They developed a language so close to Hebrew that scholars reading the Mesha stele for the first time were struck by how much they could understand without being trained in Moabite specifically. The two peoples shared something deeper than geography. They shared, in the most literal sense possible, family. Moab was not a stranger from the far edge of the world. Moab was not a nation that arrived from some distant land with no connection to the story of Israel. Moab was kin, family from the wrong side of the story. Yes, family, born from a night that no one would have chosen. Yes, but family nonetheless. And that kinship is part of what makes everything that follows so complicated. Because the story of Moab and Israel is not the story of two nations who happen to share a border. It is the story of two peoples who came from the same broken moment in history, grew up next to each other, developed in different directions, and could never quite figure out whether the relationship between them was one of kinship or hostility. It was both. It was always both. The child born in the cave grew up. His descendants multiplied. They built their kingdom on the plateau above the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, looking west across the water toward the land that another branch of the same family tree would one day claim as the Promised Land. Two peoples, one horizon, and a shared origin that neither of them could quite escape. That is where the story of Moab begins. Not in triumph, not in promise. In a cave, in the dark, in the wreckage of a world that two women believed had ended, with a child who was named for exactly what he came from. The question the name never stopped asking was simple: is that all you are? Chapter 2. The Land Between. There is a kind of place that history keeps returning to, not because the place is beautiful, though it often is, not because it sits at the center of things, though it sometimes does, but because it occupies a position that makes conflict inevitable and identity complicated, a place that is always between something, between empires, between peoples, between what one group claims as theirs and what another group claims as theirs. Moab was that kind of place. Picture a farmer on that plateau, sometime in the 10th century before Christ. It is early morning. The sun is coming up behind him, over the desert to the east. In front of him, the land drops away in steep terraced hills toward the water far below. The Dead Sea, blue-gray and motionless at the bottom of the world. On the far side of the water, barely visible in the morning haze, are the hills of Judah. He has been farming this land his whole life. His father farmed it before him, his grandfather before that. He speaks a language that a man from Bethlehem on the other side of that water would largely understand. He worships a god named Chemosh. He pays taxes to a king in Dibon. And every morning, he looks west across the water at the hills of a people who are, in the most uncomfortable sense of the word, his cousins. This is where Moab lived. Look at a map of the ancient Near East and find the Dead Sea. It is the lowest point on the surface of the earth, a body of water so saturated with salt that nothing lives in it. Sitting in a deep geological rift between what we now call Israel and Jordan. On the western shore, the hill country of Judah drops sharply down to the water. On the eastern shore, the land rises just as sharply back up to a high plateau. That plateau is Moab. It runs roughly 60 miles from north to south. Grain grows here. The famous description in the book of Ruth of fields heavy with barley is not poetic exaggeration. It is agricultural reality. The land of Moab could feed people. And it did. For centuries. To the north, across a river gorge called the Arnon, lay territory that shifted hands repeatedly between Moab and the Amorites, and later Israel. The Arnon was Moab's natural northern boundary at certain points in history, though the kingdom expanded and contracted depending on the strength of whoever sat on the throne. To the south, the land gradually gave way to the desert territory of Edom, another nation with its own complicated relationship to the family tree of Abraham. To the west, across the Dead Sea, was the land that Israel would come to call home, close enough to see on a clear day, far enough away to be a different world. This geography shaped everything about Moab. It made them prosperous enough to be worth fighting over, It made them strategically positioned along trade routes connecting Arabia to the north. It made them neighbors, in the most unavoidable sense of the word, to a people with whom they shared blood but not covenant, language but not law, and a long memory of a shared origin that neither side interpreted the same way. Now let us talk about who the Moabites actually were as a people, because they are almost always described in relation to Israel, as enemies or rivals or temptations, and almost never described on their own terms. That absence is itself a kind of erasure. The Moabites spoke a language that modern scholars classify as a Canaanite dialect, closely related to Hebrew, so closely related that when the Mesha stele was first studied in the 19th century, scholars trained in biblical Hebrew could read large portions of it with only modest difficulty. The grammar, the vocabulary, the way sentences were constructed, all of it pointed to a shared linguistic ancestry. Language is identity. Language is the shape of how a people thinks, the structure through which they understand the world and their place in it. When two peoples share the deep bones of a language, they share more than words. They share a way of being in the world that runs deeper than politics or religion or the accidents of history. Moab and Israel thought in the same grammatical structure, and yet they were, in almost every other sense, different peoples. The difference, at its most fundamental, was theological. Israel's identity was built around a covenant with a specific God who had spoken to specific ancestors, made specific promises, and required specific forms of faithfulness in return. This covenant was the spine of everything. It determined who belonged and who did not. Moab had no such covenant. Moab had Chemosh. Chemosh was the national god of Moab in the way that other ancient Near Eastern peoples had national gods. He was not understood as the only god in existence. The ancient world was not monotheistic in the way that later Western religion became. Rather, each nation had its primary deity, the god who fought for them, who gave them victory or allowed their defeat, who received their sacrifices and protected their borders. The Bible calls Chemosh the abomination of Moab. That is the language of a tradition describing a god it regards as false. But the Mesha stele uses entirely different language. On that stone, Chemosh is the one who gives the king victory. Chemosh is the one who tells the king where to fight and where to hold back. Chemosh is glorified when Moabite land is recovered. Two peoples, two names for what they held most sacred. When Israel won a battle, the text said it was because God had given them the victory. When Moab won a battle, Mesha said it was because Chemosh had given him the victory. The logic was identical. The theology was different in ways that mattered enormously to everyone involved. Understanding this is not optional for reading the story of Moab. It is essential, because so much of what happens between these two peoples is legible only when you understand that they were not just political rivals. They were theological opponents in a world where theology and military power and national identity were not separate categories. They were the same category. The capital of Moab, which the Mesha stele calls Dibon, sat on the northern plateau and served as the administrative and religious center of the kingdom. Mesha himself built extensively in Dibon, including a sanctuary for Chemosh. Smaller towns dotted the landscape. The economy depended on the land. The social structure followed patterns common to the ancient Near East. A king at the top, supported by a military and administrative class, with the bulk of the population working the fields. The King's Highway, one of the major trade routes of the ancient world, ran through or near Moabite territory, connecting Egypt in the south to Damascus and Mesopotamia in the north. This route brought Moab into contact with the larger world, with merchants and soldiers and travelers carrying goods and ideas from far beyond the plateau. It also made Moab strategically significant in ways that had nothing to do with its own ambitions. All of this matters because it corrects a misreading that is easy to fall into when you encounter Moab only through the biblical text. Moab in the Bible appears primarily as a problem. as a source of temptation, as an obstacle, as a nation that opposes Israel at critical moments. Reading only those passages, you could easily conclude that Moab was simply a people who existed to serve as a negative example in Israel's story. But Moab was not a supporting character in someone else's narrative. Moab was not a stranger from the edge of the world. Moab was family from the wrong side of the story. And the most remarkable thing about the story of Moab is not that Israel remembered them as enemies. That is easy to understand. What is remarkable is that the story does not let Moab disappear, even after the enmity is established. Moab keeps coming back, not always as enemy, sometimes as neighbor, sometimes as refuge, sometimes as the place from which something unexpected comes. The land between the Arnon Gorge and the southern desert, the plateau above the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, fertile enough to live on, strategic enough to fight over, close enough to Israel to be family, far enough from Israel's covenant to be something else entirely. That is where Moab grew. Not in the cave. In the end. The cave was the beginning, but Moab grew up in the open air of the plateau, in the fields and the cities and the sight lines that looked west across the water to a land that belonged to people who shared their language but not their God, their blood but not their story. And the question that geography kept asking, morning after morning, generation after generation, was one that neither people had a clean answer to. What do you do with the people you cannot fully claim and cannot fully leave behind? Chapter 3. The King Who Was Afraid. There is a moment when a powerful man realizes that power is not enough. It does not come when the threat is distant. It does not come when there is still room to maneuver, still time to send diplomats or find some arrangement that keeps everyone comfortable. It comes when the threat is close enough to see with your own eyes, close enough to feel in your chest before your mind has finished processing what you are looking at. That moment came to Balak, king of Moab, when he looked out from his high plateau and saw Israel, not a rumor of Israel, not a report from a messenger who had seen them 3 weeks ago and ridden hard to deliver the news. Israel itself, camped on the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan, north of the Dead Sea, at a place called Acacia Grove. The text says the Israelites camped there like a great multitude, spreading across the land, and Balak was terrified. The text is specific about what he felt. It says Moab was overcome with fear because of the people of Israel. It says Moab was in dread. These are not the emotions of a man who has looked at a tactical problem and decided it needs attention. These are the emotions of a man who has looked at something and understood, in the part of him that understands things before the reasoning begins, that the rules have changed. He had reason to be afraid. Israel had just done something that Moab would have considered nearly impossible. They had defeated the Amorites. Specifically, they had defeated a king named Sihon, who ruled the territory north of the Arnon River, and another king named Og of Bashan, whose reputation for power was so established that the Bible mentions his bed was made of iron and was more than 13 feet long. These were not small victories against minor opponents. Sihon and Og were significant regional powers, and Israel had defeated both of them. Balak knew this. The text says he saw everything Israel had done to the Amorites. He had been watching, and what he saw told him that conventional military calculation was not going to be sufficient here. Now stop and consider who Balak was before we judge what he did next. Balak was a king of a middle-sized kingdom trying to protect his people. He did not have the armies of Egypt or the resources of Assyria. He had the Moabite plateau, the Moabite army, and the Moabite god Chemosh, who had given them victory before. But the circumstances here were not right, and Balak could see that clearly. He was a practical man facing an impractical problem, so he did what practical men in the ancient world did when conventional solutions were insufficient. He reached for a different kind of power. He sent messengers, not to a neighboring king asking for military alliance. He sent messengers east, across the Euphrates River, to a man whose reputation had apparently traveled far enough that a Moabite king in a crisis knew exactly where to find him. The man's name was Balaam, son of Beor, and he lived in a place called Pethor. Balaam is not only a biblical figure. In 1967, archaeologists excavating a site in the Jordan Valley called Deir Allah found fragments of an inscription written on plaster. Not stone, not papyrus, but plaster on a wall. The kind of writing that does not survive unless the conditions are exactly right. The inscription, dated to roughly the 8th century before Christ, describes a figure named Balaam, son of Beor, who receives visions in the night. The same name, the same father, the same kind of nocturnal revelation. This does not confirm every detail of the story in Numbers, but it does confirm that a figure named Balaam, son of Beor, was known in traditions outside the Bible, that his reputation as a seer was wide enough to be carved on a wall in a Jordanian valley, centuries after the events Numbers describes. Which means when Balak sent his distinguished messengers across the Euphrates, he was not simply reaching for a character in a story. He was reaching for a real reputation. What Balak believed about Balaam is stated plainly in the message he sent. He said that the person Balaam blessed was blessed and the person Balaam cursed was cursed. This was not a figure of speech. Balak was operating within a worldview in which certain people had a genuine, functional connection to the divine that gave their words real power in the world. A curse from someone with that connection could break an army before the first sword was drawn. Balak's message to Balaam was direct. He said, a people had come out of Egypt, and they covered the face of the earth, and they were living right next to him. He asked Balaam to come and curse this people for him, because they were too mighty for him to fight directly. Perhaps then he would be able to defeat them and drive them from the land. Perhaps. That single word reveals something important about Balak. He was not a man who believed the curse was automatically effective. He was a man who believed it was worth trying, who understood that in the kind of world he was living in, with the kind of opponent he was facing, every possible tool deserved consideration. The messengers arrived at Balaam's door with fees for divination in their hands, which is to say they came prepared to pay. This was not a casual request. Balak was investing resources in this plan. He believed it could work. What happened that night in Balaam's house is the first indication that this story is not going to go the way Balak planned. God came to Balaam and asked him who these men were. Balaam told him, and God said something that should have ended the entire enterprise immediately. He told Balaam not to go with them. He told Balaam not to curse the people of Israel because they were blessed. Balaam told the messengers in the morning that God would not let him go with them. They went back to Balak. Balak did not accept this answer. He sent more messengers, more numerous and more distinguished than the first group, and the offer they carried was more explicit. Balak told Balaam he would honor him greatly and do whatever Balaam said, and that he should come and curse this people. Balaam's response is one of the most revealing moments in the entire account. He said that even if Balak gave him his house full of silver and gold, he could not go beyond the word of the Lord his God to do less or more. But then he told the messengers to stay the night so he could find out what else God might say to him. Read that carefully. He had already received a clear answer. God had said, "Do not go," and yet Balaam asked the messengers to stay overnight so he could inquire again. He was not disobeying. Not yet. But he was looking for a way through a door that had been clearly closed. God came to him again that night and said, "If the men have come to call you, rise and go with them, but only do what I tell you to do." This permission, granted with a condition attached, becomes the pivot on which the entire story turns. Balaam was allowed to go. He was not allowed to say anything other than what God gave him to say. In the morning, Balaam saddled his donkey and went with the princes of Moab. And then something happened on the road that is one of the strangest and most carefully constructed scenes in the entire Hebrew Bible. The donkey saw something Balaam did not see. An angel of the Lord was standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand. The donkey turned off the road into a field. Balaam struck the donkey to turn her back to the road. The angel moved to a narrow place between two vineyards with walls on both sides. The donkey pressed against the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. He struck her again. Then the angel moved to a place so narrow there was no room to turn either right or left. The donkey lay down under Balaam. He struck her a third time. 3 times the donkey saw what the prophet did not see. 3 times she responded to the invisible reality in front of her, and 3 times was beaten for it. And then God opened the donkey's mouth. What the donkey said was not a proclamation or a prophecy. It was a simple question. She asked him what she had done to him that he had struck her 3 times. And Balaam answered her. He told her she had made a fool of him and that if he had a sword in his hand he would kill her right now. The donkey asked if she was not his donkey, on whom he had ridden all his life. She asked if she had ever been in the habit of treating him this way. Balaam said no. Then God opened Balaam's eyes and he saw the angel standing in the road with the drawn sword, and he fell on his face. The angel told him the donkey had saved his life, that if she had not turned aside, the angel would have killed Balaam and let the donkey live. This scene is not simply a strange miracle. It is a piece of very deliberate storytelling about a man who can access divine knowledge for hire but cannot see the divine presence directly in front of him on the road. The donkey, the most ordinary creature in the ancient world's transportation system, sees what the famous diviner misses. The animal that carries Balaam to his work understands the situation more clearly than Balaam does. It is the Bible's way of establishing, before Balaam opens his mouth to do what Balak has hired him to do, that Balaam does not control what comes out of his mouth when he stands before the God of Israel. He never did. He never could. The angel let Balaam continue to Balak, but the instruction was repeated. Speak only the word that God gives you. Balak came out to meet Balaam and asked why he had not come earlier. He had said he was perfectly able to honor him. Balaam answered that he had come, but that he had no power to say anything other than the word that God put in his mouth. He said it directly. He warned Balak before a single sacrifice was offered or a single high place was climbed. But Balak was not listening to the warning. He was thinking about the curse he needed. They went together to a high place, where Balak could see the edge of the Israelite camp spread out below them. And Balak said, "Curse this people for me." He was a king who had run out of conventional options, standing on a high place with a hired prophet beside him, looking down at the multitude that terrified him, certain that this was going to work. He did not yet know what Balaam was going to say. He did not yet know that what he had arranged so carefully was about to produce exactly the opposite of what he had paid for. He stood on the high place above the camp of Israel and waited, and Balaam opened his mouth. Chapter 4. The Prophet Who Could Not Curse. Balaam looked out over the camp of Israel and spoke. What came out of his mouth was not a curse. It was a blessing. The first oracle began with a question that reframed everything Balak thought he was doing. Balaam asked how he could curse what God had not cursed, how he could denounce what God had not denounced. He looked at Israel spread across the valley below and said he saw a people living apart, not counting themselves among the nations. He said, who could count the dust of Jacob or number the 4th part of Israel? And then, standing on a Moabite high place, paid by a Moabite king, he said, let me die the death of the righteous, and let my end be like theirs. Balak's response was immediate and furious. He said, what have you done to me? He said he had brought Balaam to curse his enemies, and Balaam had done nothing but bless them. Balaam told him plainly. He said he had to speak what the Lord put in his mouth. Now let us stop here and consider what is happening in this exchange, because it is easy to read past the weight of it. Balaam has just told a king, to his face, that he cannot do what the king has paid him to do, not because he lacks skill, not because the conditions were wrong or the sacrifice insufficient, but because the source of his ability is not his own. and that source has given him something to say that is not what Balak wants to hear. And Balaam says it anyway. This is not a small act of courage. Balak is a king with resources and soldiers, and the authority that comes with having sent a distinguished delegation across the Euphrates to bring this man to his high place. He has sacrificed oxen and sheep. He is owed something, by any reasonable accounting of the transaction. And Balaam tells him, I have no choice. Balak did not give up. He told Balaam to come with him to another place. Another high place from which he could see the Israelite camp from a different angle. Perhaps from a different vantage point the oracle would come out differently. Perhaps if Balaam could only see part of the camp rather than all of it, the words would change. Balak was still operating as though the problem was technical, as though the right combination of location and sacrifice and positioning would produce the result he needed. He built 7 altars. He offered a bull and a ram on each one. 7 altars, 7 bulls, 7 rams. This was not a casual effort. Balak was pouring resources into this attempt with the desperation of a man who has no other plan. Balaam went off to seek God and came back and delivered the second oracle. The second blessing was more direct than the first. It made declarative statements about Israel that must have felt, to Balak, like wounds delivered with each word. Balaam said God was not a man that he should lie, not a human being that he should change his mind. He said God had spoken a blessing and he could not reverse it. He said there was no misfortune in Jacob, no trouble in Israel. He said the Lord their God was with them and the shout of a king was among them. Balak said to Balaam, neither curse them at all nor bless them at all. This is the response of a man who has realized he is not going to get what he came for and is now trying to cut his losses. If he cannot have the curse, at least let there be silence. Silence is less damaging than blessing. But Balaam had already told him. He could only say what God gave him to say. Balak tried a third time. He took Balaam to yet another high place, a mountain called Peor that overlooked the desert. He built 7 more altars. He offered 7 more bulls and 7 more rams. And Balaam looked out from that mountain, and the Spirit of God came on him, and he delivered the third oracle. This third oracle was the most elaborate of the 3, and the most explicitly focused on Israel's future. Balaam described the beauty of their tents, their spreading branches, their waters running to the sea. He said those who blessed Israel were blessed, and those who cursed Israel were cursed. Balak's anger burned against Balaam. He struck his hands together, which in the ancient world was a gesture of extreme frustration or contempt. He told Balaam to go back to his own place. He said he had intended to honor Balaam greatly, but the Lord had kept him from honor. Notice what Balak said there. The Lord had kept him from honor. Even in his fury, even in his dismissal of Balaam, Balak acknowledged the source of the problem. He was not accusing Balaam of changing his mind or losing his nerve. He understood, at some level, that what had happened on those 3 high places was not under Balaam's control. The God of Israel had overridden everything Balak had set in motion. Balaam reminded Balak that he had told the original messengers exactly this. He had warned Balak before a single altar was built on a single high place. Balak had not listened. And now, before leaving, Balaam delivered a 4th oracle, not requested, not paid for, offered out of what the text suggests was a simple compulsion to say the true thing while he was still standing there. He spoke of a star coming out of Jacob, a scepter rising out of Israel, a future ruler who would crush the enemies of Israel on every side. Balaam had come to curse Israel and had blessed them 4 times. He had been hired to speak death over a people and had spoken life. Now here is the thing that careful readers of this story have always noticed, and that the text itself eventually makes explicit. Balaam left. He went back to his own place. As Balak had told him, the transaction was over. The curses had not been delivered. From the surface of the narrative, it might appear that Balaam was simply a man who had done the honest thing and gone home. But the story does not let Balaam leave clean. Later texts in the Bible connect him to something else that happened near the plains of Moab. Something that the direct curse was unable to accomplish. Something that required a different kind of attack entirely. The failure of the curse did not mean Israel was safe. It meant the threat was going to take a different form. And what came next would not arrive as an army on a battlefield or a prophet on a high place. It would arrive through something much harder to defend against than swords or words. It would arrive through proximity, through shared meals and shared celebrations and the slow, ordinary, the dangerous process of two peoples living close enough to each other that the boundaries between them began to feel less fixed than they had seemed from a distance. Balak had tried to break Israel from the outside. What came next would try to break Israel from the inside. And the plains of Moab, where the people had camped so peacefully beneath all those high places where curses were failing to form, would become the site of a disaster that no oracle had prevented because no oracle had been aimed at it. Balaam went home. The danger did not go with him. Chapter 5. When the boundary broke. Israel was still camped on the plains of Moab. The threat from the high places had passed. The curses that Balak had paid for had come back as blessings. The armies had not moved against each other. By any visible measure, Israel was safe. And then Israel began to worship Baal of Peor. The text moves into this with the same flat, documentary patience it uses for almost everything. It does not build to it dramatically. It simply says that while Israel was staying at Acacia Grove, the men began to have relations with Moabite women, and the Moabite women invited them to the sacrifices of their gods, and they ate and bowed down to their gods. That is how quickly it happened. Not an invasion, not a military campaign, not a prophet on a mountaintop trying to call divine power down on an enemy camp. Just people living near each other, sharing food, being invited to celebrations, following the ordinary human instinct toward connection and the warmth of being included rather than excluded. And somewhere in that ordinary human process, the boundary broke. Now let us be precise about what we are talking about, because this is a passage that has often been read in ways that obscure more than they reveal. To be clear, the problem was not that connection existed. Two peoples living near each other will always find their way to each other's tables. The problem was that Israel had not yet learned how to remain itself while living close to people it could not simply avoid. The wilderness had kept the question theoretical. The plains of Moab made it real. In the ancient world, religious practice and communal life were not separate categories. When the Moabite women invited the Israelite men to their sacrifices, they were not asking them to switch religions in a formal sense. They were asking them to participate in the communal celebrations that made Moabite society what it was. The sharing of food, the joining of the gathering, the presence at the place where a people expressed their identity most publicly. And the Israelite men went. These were people who had been in the wilderness for decades, who had grown up in a community that was always moving, always defined against its environment, always maintaining its distinctness through laws and rituals. And now they were stopped, camped in one place, in a land where people had homes and fields and celebrations and the kind of rootedness that the wilderness had not offered. The Moabite women were their neighbors, their hosts, in a sense, since this was Moabite territory, and the celebrations they were invited to were not obscure or hidden. They were the public expressions of a people's life, the boundary between inside and outside, which had seemed so clear in the abstract language of law and covenant, was much harder to maintain when you were sitting across from an actual person who was passing you food and asking you to stay. The text names one specific incident in the middle of this general account. A man named Zimri, from a prominent Israelite family of the tribe of Simeon, brought a Midianite woman named Cosbi to his family in the sight of the whole community of Israel while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He did this publicly, not hiding it, not apologizing for it, in front of Moses and in front of the entire congregation. And a man named Phinehas, grandson of Aaron the priest, saw it. Phinehas took a spear and followed them into the tent and drove it through both of them, through Zimri and through Cosbi. And the plague that had been killing the Israelites stopped. 24,000 people had died in the plague before that moment. 24,000 deaths from a disaster that had begun not with an army crossing a border, but with an invitation to a celebration. Now we need to sit with the full weight of what this story contains, because it is tempting to read it only through the lens of judgment and miss what it actually reveals about the situation on the plains of Moab. The boundary that broke at Peor was not simply a religious boundary. It was the boundary between two peoples who were, as we have established, closer to each other than either of them was comfortable admitting. They shared a language. They shared a landscape. They shared, at the deepest historical level, an origin. When Israelite men ate with Moabite women and participated in their celebrations, they were not crossing into entirely foreign territory. They were crossing into the territory of people who were, in the most uncomfortable sense of the word, kin. And the response that the text records, the plague, the violence of Phinehas, the deaths of 24,000 people, has to be understood as the response of a community that experienced this particular boundary crossing as an existential threat, not simply a moral failing, a threat to the thing that made Israel Israel, what the episode at Peor establishes, beyond the specific events of those days, is something that will shape the relationship between Israel and Moab for generations. Moab is dangerous, not because Moab is militarily superior. The oracles of Balaam have just established that Israel's God is more than capable of handling that dimension of the threat. Moab is dangerous because of proximity, because of the specific kind of threat that comes from people who are close enough to share meals and celebrations, whose culture is attractive in the way that any living culture is attractive to someone who has been wandering in a wilderness. The boundary between Israel and Moab is not a wall. It never was. It is a line that has to be maintained actively, deliberately, against the constant pressure of ordinary human contact. And at Peor, under the most peaceful external conditions Israel had experienced in a long time, the line gave way. 24,000 people died. The plains of Moab, where Balaam had stood on 3 high places and been unable to curse Israel, had produced a disaster that no curse could have manufactured. The weapon was not supernatural. It was human. Connection. Hospitality. The ordinary chemistry of people living near each other long enough to start seeming like neighbors rather than strangers. Israel moved on from Peor, carrying the memory of what had happened there. The name Baal of Peor became a shorthand in later texts for a particular kind of failure, a particular kind of vulnerability that the wilderness discipline had not fully addressed, and the law that would follow, the law that would try to codify the hard lesson of those plains in language precise enough to prevent it from happening again, would name Moab specifically, not as the only people who posed this kind of risk, but as the people in whose shadow the risk had been most devastatingly realized. The law that came next would not forget Peor. It would remember it in the most permanent form available. It would write Moab's name into the boundary itself. Chapter 6. The Law That Remembered. Laws are not written in a vacuum. They are written in the aftermath of something. They are the response of a community that has experienced a threat and is trying to make sure the experience does not have to be lived again. Behind every legal prohibition is a story. Behind every boundary written into code is a moment when the boundary was tested and found insufficient. The law in Deuteronomy 23 is one of those laws. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever. Read that slowly. Not 1 generation, not 3, 10 generations. In the ancient world, 10 generations was not a precise number, so much as a way of saying as far as the human mind can project forward. It was the biblical equivalent of saying for as long as you can imagine anyone being affected by this decision. And then the text adds the word forever, as if 10 generations were not enough, as if the writer wanted to make sure no one found a technicality. No one argued that the 10 generations had passed and the door was now open. The assembly of the Lord. This was not a peripheral category. This was the central gathering of the covenant community, the place where Israel came together as a people before God. Exclusion from the assembly was not simply a social inconvenience. It was exclusion from the defining act of Israel's corporate identity. It meant you could live among the people, but you could never fully be of the people. And Moab was named specifically. The text does not leave the reader to guess at the reason. It explains itself immediately. The reason for this exclusion is that they did not meet you with bread and water on your way out of Egypt, and because they hired Balaam son of Beor from Pethor in Mesopotamia to curse you. However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam. The Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you because the Lord your God loves you. 2 charges. 2 reasons why 10 generations and forever were the appropriate response. The first charge was the failure of hospitality, in a world where traveling without supplies could mean death. The refusal of hospitality was not a minor social failure. It was the refusal to acknowledge a basic human obligation to travelers who were vulnerable. The second charge was the hiring of Balaam, the attempt to use spiritual power against Israel, the investment of resources in a campaign designed not with swords but with curses. But notice what the text also says in the middle of those charges. The Lord your God would not listen to Balaam. The Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing. The law is written in the shadow of a failure that did not work. Moab tried to curse Israel, and the curse became a blessing. The law is not responding to a successful attack. It is responding to an attempted attack, to an intention, to the demonstrated willingness of a neighbor to reach for the most destructive tool available when they felt threatened. That willingness was enough to write the law. Now let us ask the question that the text does not ask, but that any honest reader eventually has to confront. Was this fair? The descendants of Moab who were born after Balak hired Balaam had not hired Balaam. The Moabite man or woman standing at the edge of the assembly in the 3rd generation after those events had not been present on the plains of Moab. They had not refused to bring bread and water. They had not sent messengers across the Euphrates. They had inherited a name and a lineage, and a history they had not chosen. And yet the law said 10 generations. Forever. The ancient world did not think about inherited guilt the way the modern world does. The idea that a nation's actions bound its descendants was not considered obviously unjust. It was considered obviously true. Nations were understood as organic entities that persisted through time, not simply as collections of individuals who happened to share a geography. What Moab did was what Moab did, not what one king and one generation of Moabites did. But the text also contains something that complicates the absolute reading of this law. Immediately after the prohibition against Moab, in the very next verses, the text addresses Edom differently. It says, "You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother." And then it says, "You shall not abhor an Egyptian because you were a sojourner in his land." The children of the 3rd generation of Edomites and Egyptians could enter the assembly. Edom and Egypt. One was the nation of Israel's close kinsman Esau. The other was the nation that had enslaved Israel for generations. Both of them were given a shorter exclusion than Moab. Moab, whose offense was refusing hospitality and hiring a prophet who failed to curse Israel, received a longer and more permanent exclusion than Egypt, which had subjected Israel to 400 years of slavery. This asymmetry is not explained in the text. It sits there without commentary, a legal puzzle that has occupied scholars and readers for centuries. Why Moab more than Egypt? One answer involves exactly the kind of proximity we discussed in the previous chapter. Egypt was far away, a great empire at a great distance. Moab was next door. Moab spoke the same language. Moab shared the family tree. Moab was the kind of threat that crept in through dinner invitations and shared celebrations, and the slow erosion of identity that comes from living too close to people who are almost you, but not quite you. Peor had demonstrated exactly how real that risk was. So the law built the boundary higher and made it more permanent, and named Moab specifically. Not because Moab's offense was the worst offense in Israel's history, but because Moab's kind of offense was the hardest to defend against through any means other than law. The assembly of the Lord, not entered by Moabites. Not for 10 generations. Not forever. This is where the story of Moab could have ended. In a legal category. A people defined by their exclusion. Referenced in the law as the reason for a permanent boundary. Remembered as the nation that tried to curse Israel and failed, and whose failure did not buy them any grace. Only a permanent marker of what they had attempted. That is where the law left Moab. But the law and the story are not the same thing. The law said 10 generations and forever. The story said something more complicated. The story said that within a few generations of the law being written, a Moabite woman would walk into Bethlehem and say words that would eventually be read as among the most profound expressions of loyalty in the entire biblical tradition. The law said, "You shall not enter the assembly." The story said her name was Ruth. The law built a wall. The story built a door in it. And the door was not built by overturning the law or arguing against it, or finding a legal technicality that made it inapplicable. The door was built by a single act of loyalty, so complete and so public and so utterly without self-interest that it forced the question the law had never quite answered. What do you do when the person standing at the boundary is more faithful than almost anyone inside it? What do you do when the one the law says cannot enter is the one who most embodies what the law was trying to protect? The law that named Moab was written from a memory of Peor and Balak, and bread and water refused on the road. It was written to prevent a particular kind of disaster from happening again. It could not have been written to prevent Ruth. Nothing in the law prepared for Ruth, because Ruth was not a threat to the boundary. She was something the boundary had not accounted for. Chapter 7. Between Judges and Kings. Israel crossed the Jordan. The wilderness was behind them. The years of wandering. The manna. The water from rocks. The cloud by day and the fire by night. All of it belonged to a chapter that was closing. Ahead of them was the land. The cities with walls. The people already living there. The long, grinding, complicated work of becoming a nation in a place, rather than simply a people in motion. What followed was not a clean conquest and a settled peace. What followed was the period the Bible calls the time of the Judges, a cycle that repeated itself with the grim regularity of a wheel that cannot find solid ground. Israel would settle into the land and begin to live according to the patterns of the people around them. Then things would go badly. Then a leader would rise and pull them back. Then the leader would die and the cycle would begin again. It was not a heroic period. It was a human period, messy and inconsistent, and full of moments that reveal what people actually do when the extraordinary pressure of the wilderness is removed and the ordinary pressure of ordinary life takes its place. And in the middle of that cycle, Moab appeared again. The text says that the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel. And Eglon gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites, and went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. 18 years. For 18 years. Eglon, king of Moab, controlled that city and the surrounding territory. For 18 years. Israel paid tribute to a Moabite king. Now let us establish who Eglon was, because the text has a way of presenting him that rewards careful reading. The only physical description the text gives of Eglon is that he was a very fat man. This detail is placed in the narrative with a precision that suggests it is not incidental. The writer of this passage knew what they were doing when they introduced the king of Moab by his body rather than his accomplishments. It colors every subsequent moment in the story with a tone that sits somewhere between dark observation and something more serious. But behind the physical description is a political reality. Eglon had accomplished something significant. He had formed a coalition, gathered allies, defeated Israel, and established enough control over part of the Promised Land to collect tribute for nearly 2 decades. Whatever else he was effective. A king who had beaten Israel and held the territory for 18 years is not a figure to be dismissed. The tribute that Israel paid during those 18 years was not simply economic. It was the tribute that subjugated peoples paid to the powers that had defeated them. It was the physical enactment of a power relationship. Every payment was a reminder of who had lost and who had won, who owed and who collected, who walked into the room with their head up and who came with what they owed in their hands. Among those who came to deliver tribute to Eglon was a man named Ehud. Ehud was from the tribe of Benjamin. The text gives us one important detail about him before the action begins. He was left-handed. In the ancient world, left-handedness was unusual enough to be notable. It was also, in a military context, potentially significant. A left-handed man carried his weapon on the right side of his body, where a guard searching for concealed weapons would not think to look. Ehud made himself a double-edged sword about 18 inches long and strapped it to his right thigh under his clothing. He went with the tribute to Eglon. After presenting the tribute, he dismissed the people who had come with him, and he said to Eglon, "I have a secret message for you." "O king," Eglon said, "silence." And all who attended him went out. Ehud came to him as he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, "I have a message from God for you." Eglon rose from his seat, and Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. The handle went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, and he did not pull the sword out of his belly. The text does not look away from this. It describes it with a specificity that makes the reader understand exactly what happened in that room. The ancient writer was not squeamish about physical reality, and neither was the ancient audience. Ehud went out onto the porch, closed the doors of the roof chamber behind him, and locked them. When the servants came and found the doors locked, they said Eglon was surely relieving himself in the cool room. They waited. They waited until they were embarrassed. Then they took the key and opened the doors, and found their lord fallen dead on the floor. While they waited, Ehud escaped. He went to the hill country of Ephraim and blew a trumpet, and the Israelites came down from the hills behind him. He told them to follow him because the Lord had given their enemies, the Moabites, into their hand. They went down and seized the fords of the Jordan and did not allow anyone to cross. 10,000 Moabites were killed. The land had rest for 80 years. 80 years is not forever, and the relationship between Israel and Moab was never going to be resolved by a single blade in a locked room. The proximity was too old. The kinship was too deep. The border was too porous for any single act of violence to close it permanently. What happened next did not happen on a battlefield or in a throne room. It happened in the fields during a famine, between ordinary people trying to survive, in the kind of situation that kings and prophets and legal codes cannot prepare anyone for. A man from Bethlehem crossed the border with his family because there was food on the other side. And that simple act of survival set in motion something that no law had anticipated and no war had produced. His name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. His sons were named Mahlon and Chilion. They went to Moab. Elimelech died there. The sons married Moabite women. One was named Orpah. One was named Ruth. Then Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left in a foreign country, without her husband and without her sons, with 2 daughters-in-law who were Moabite women, in a land where Moabite women had a specific legal status in relation to the assembly of Israel. And she decided to go home. What happened when she told her daughters-in-law she was leaving is the beginning of one of the most carefully constructed stories in the entire biblical canon. Chapter 8. The Woman Who Crossed the Line. There is a road between Moab and Bethlehem. It runs west from the plateau, down through the hills, across the Jordan Valley, and up into the Judean highlands where Bethlehem sits. It is not a short road. It is the kind of road that gives a person time to think, time to reconsider, time to turn around and go back before the point of no return has been crossed. Naomi had started down that road with 2 women beside her. She stopped and told them to go back. What she said to them was not unkind. It was the most practical and honest thing she could have said to 2 young Moabite widows standing at the beginning of a road that led to a country where they had no status, no family, no legal protection, and no future that anyone could reasonably promise them. She told them to return to their mother's houses. She asked the Lord to deal kindly with them as they had dealt with the dead and with her. She kissed them, and they wept. They said they would return with her to her people. Naomi pushed back harder. She told them to turn back. She asked whether she had more sons in her womb who could be their husbands. She laid out the arithmetic of her situation with a clarity that left no room for sentiment. She was too old to have a husband. Even if she had a husband that night and bore sons, would they wait until those sons were grown? She told them her situation was more bitter than theirs because the hand of the Lord had gone out against her. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and turned back, and Ruth held on to her. Naomi told her to look. Her sister-in-law had gone back to her people and to her gods. She told Ruth to return after her sister-in-law, and Ruth said what she said. "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go I will go, and where you lodge I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also if anything but death parts me from you." Read that again with the full context of everything we have covered to this point. This is a Moabite woman speaking, a woman whose people had refused bread and water to Israel on the road, whose king had hired a prophet to curse Israel, whose name was written into the law as a reason for permanent exclusion from the assembly of the Lord, a woman who had grown up in a culture that worshipped Chemosh, that organized its understanding of history around a god that the biblical text called an abomination. She is speaking to a woman from Bethlehem, from the tribe of Judah, from the people whose law said that Ruth's people could not enter the assembly even to the 10th generation. And she says, "Your people shall be my people and your God my God." There is a reason this speech has been read at weddings for centuries, in a culture that did not produce it, by people who share neither the language nor the religion nor the geography of the woman who first said it. It is not because the words are pretty. It is because they describe something that every person who has ever chosen loyalty over convenience has felt in their body before they found the words for it. The moment when you realize that the bond you thought was contractual has become something else. Something that does not need a contract because it is not a contract anymore. Ruth did not choose Israel. She chose Naomi. And in choosing Naomi, she chose everything Naomi carried: the God, the people, the land, the law that would name her as an outsider. The gate she would have to walk through, she knew about the gate. She walked toward it anyway. That is not only a religious decision, that is a human decision. The kind that has been made in every culture and every century by people standing at the edge of belonging, deciding whether to step across or step back. Ruth stepped across. Now let us talk about what the Hebrew word hesed means, because it is impossible to understand the book of Ruth without it. Hesed is used 3 times in the book of Ruth, and each time it marks the pivot of the story. It means something in the range of loyal love, steadfast kindness, covenant faithfulness. But those translations, accurate as they are, do not quite capture the specific quality of hesed that makes it theologically significant. Hesed is not simply kindness. Kindness can be a response to someone who has been kind to you. Hesed is kindness that goes beyond what the relationship requires. It is faithfulness that continues past the point where faithfulness is obligatory. It is the choice to act as if you are bound to someone when the bonds that bound you have been cut. Naomi's husband was dead. Her sons were dead. Ruth was a widow with no children and no legal obligation to the family she had married into. In the ancient Near Eastern world, the death of a husband dissolved the formal obligations of the wife to her husband's family. Ruth owed Naomi nothing. Nothing except whatever she chose to give from a place inside herself that the law could not reach. She gave everything, and the text calls it hesed, the same word the biblical writers used for what God does for Israel, when God keeps the covenant even when Israel breaks it. The same word for the quality of divine faithfulness that persists beyond deserving. The same word that sits at the theological heart of what it means for God to be trustworthy. Ruth the Moabite was performing hesed. This is the collision that the book of Ruth forces on the reader. The law said Moab could not enter the assembly. The law was written to protect the covenant community from the kind of dissolution that Peor had demonstrated was possible. The law was a response to real experience, a real threat, a real catastrophe. And here was a Moabite woman embodying the covenant's deepest value more completely than most people inside the covenant managed to embody it. The two of them came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. The whole town was stirred because of them. The women said, "Is this Naomi?" And Naomi told them not to call her Naomi, which meant pleasant. She told them to call her Mara, which meant bitter. She said she had gone away full and the Lord had brought her back empty. Ruth went to glean in the fields. Gleaning was the provision in Israelite law that allowed the poor to follow behind the harvesters and collect what was left. It was a legal right built into the agricultural system, a structural acknowledgement that the land's abundance belonged to the whole community. She went to the field of a man named Boaz. Boaz noticed her. He asked his servant who she was. The servant told him she was the Moabite woman who had come back with Naomi from the country of Moab. He told Boaz she had asked to glean and had been working from early morning until now without resting even a moment. And Boaz spoke to Ruth. He told her not to go to glean in another field but to stay close to his young women. He told her he had charged the young men not to touch her. He told her to drink from the vessels when she was thirsty. Ruth fell on her face and bowed to the ground and asked him why she had found favor in his eyes. Since she was a foreigner, Boaz answered her. He said all that she had done for her mother-in-law since the death of her husband had been fully told to him. He said he knew she had left her father and mother and her native land and had come to a people she had not known before. He said, "May the Lord repay her for what she had done, and may she find a full reward under whose wings she had come to take refuge." He used the image of wings, the same image the Psalms use for the protection of God. Shelter beneath the wings of the Lord. And he applied it to a Moabite woman standing in his field. He knew who she was. He knew she was a Moabite woman. He knew what the law said. And he spoke to her with the directness of a man who had heard what she had done for Naomi and had made a decision about what that information required of him. The story that follows has the careful architecture of a tale that knows exactly where it is going and takes pleasure in the journey. Ruth returned to Naomi with more grain than a gleaner normally came home with and told her about Boaz. Naomi recognized his name and told Ruth he was a close relative of theirs, one of their redeemers. The concept of the Redeemer was a specific legal institution in ancient Israel. A kinsman redeemer was a male relative who had both the right and the obligation to restore what a family member had lost. If a widow had no son to carry on her husband's name and inheritance, a kinsman redeemer could marry her and produce an heir who would carry the name of the dead man into the next generation. Naomi saw what was happening in the field, and she saw what it meant. Ruth continued to glean in Boaz's fields through the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. Then Naomi gave Ruth instructions that required a level of trust on Ruth's part that deserves to be named clearly. She told her to wash, anoint herself, put on her cloak, and go to the threshing floor at night. She told her not to make herself known to Boaz until he had finished eating and drinking. And then she told her to go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he would tell her what to do. Ruth said, "All that you tell me I will do." She went to the threshing floor at night. She uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over. There was a woman lying at his feet. He asked who she was. She said, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." The same image she had used, the same wings. She was asking him directly to be for her what Naomi had told her he could be. Boaz told her not to be afraid. He said she had shown more kindness in this second act than in the first, in that she had not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. He said all his fellow townsmen knew she was a worthy woman. He used the same word the book of Proverbs uses for the woman of valor, the worthy woman, applied to Ruth, the Moabite. But there was a complication. There was another redeemer closer in relation than Boaz. This man had the first right and the first obligation. Boaz could not simply act without addressing that prior claim. He told Ruth to stay until morning and he would settle the matter. The next morning Boaz went to the gate of the city, which was where legal transactions happened in the ancient world. He found the other redeemer and gathered 10 elders of the city as witnesses. He told the other redeemer about the piece of land that Naomi was selling. He gave him the first opportunity to redeem it. The other man said he would redeem it. Then Boaz told him that on the day he bought the field from Naomi, he would also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, to restore the name of the dead to his inheritance. The other redeemer said he could not redeem it. He said it would damage his own inheritance. He told Boaz to redeem it himself. He took off his sandal and gave it to Boaz. In the custom of that time, this was the legal gesture that finalized the transfer of the right of redemption. Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses." He said he had acquired everything that was Elimelech's and everything that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. He said he had also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, to be his wife. And then he said something that the law in Deuteronomy had not prepared for. He said he was doing this to restore the name of the dead to his inheritance, so that the name of the dead would not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. The gate of his native place, the place where legal transactions happened, the place where belonging was established and confirmed, the place that the law said a Moabite could not enter to the 10th generation. Ruth the Moabite was being brought in through the gate by a man who stood up at that gate and said, in front of 10 elders and all the people, that she was his wife. The elders said something that has been read as a blessing for thousands of years. They said, "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel." They invoked the names of the matriarchs, the founding mothers of the nation. They placed Ruth in that lineage by name. Ruth, the Moabite. Like Rachel and Leah, Boaz and Ruth had a son. They named him Obed. Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name and said, "A son has been born to Naomi." The book ends with a genealogy. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David, the Moabite woman who crossed the line. The woman, the law said, could not enter the assembly. The woman who chose Hesed when she owed nothing. The woman who said, "Your God, my God," and meant it and proved it with every subsequent day of her life. Her grandson was the king whose name a blind man outside Jericho would use 1,000 years later when he needed something from a son of David passing by on the road. The law said 10 generations and forever. The story said her name was Ruth. Both things are in the text, and the text does not explain how they fit together. It just tells you both and leaves you standing at the gate with the question that Moab had been asking since a woman named it for what it came from in a cave above Zoar. Does origin define destiny? Ruth's answer was not a theological argument. It was not a legal brief. It was a life, lived on the other side of a line that the law had drawn and that she had crossed before anyone at the gate had the chance to ask her for her credentials. Chapter 9. David's Moabite Shadow. There is a detail in the story of David that most people read past without stopping. When David was fleeing from Saul, when he was living in caves and moving through the wilderness with a band of desperate men, when he had no throne and no army and no certainty that he would survive the week, he went to Moab. Not to fight Moab, not to hide from Moab. He went to Moab and asked the king of Moab for something that reveals exactly how complicated the relationship between David and this particular nation actually was. He asked the king of Moab to let his father and his mother come and stay with them while he discovered what God would do for him. He sent his parents to Moab for safekeeping. The man who would become the greatest king in Israel's history, the man whose name would be written into the covenant promise as the foundation of an eternal dynasty, sent the people he loved most to the country whose name was written into the law as a permanent boundary against belonging. He sent them to Moab because Moab was safe. Because when Saul was hunting him through the hills of Judah, the place David trusted with the lives of his parents was the plateau across the Dead Sea, the country that the law excluded, the country that his great-grandmother Ruth had come from, carrying a bundle of barley and a word in her chest that the law had not put there. The tradition that remembers David also remembers the Moabite woman in his line. The two memories are inseparable. You cannot tell where David came from without saying her name. He knew the story. He knew that the blood in his veins included blood from the plateau east of the Dead Sea, from the people who worshipped Chemosh, from the nation that Deuteronomy 23 had named as permanently outside the assembly of the Lord. He knew, and when he needed somewhere to send his parents, he sent them there. The prophet Gad told David to leave Moab and return to Judah. He did. His parents stayed in Moab for the duration of his time in the wilderness. The text simply says David's parents were with the king of Moab all the time David was in the stronghold. Now let us carry that detail forward across the years that followed. Because what happens to Moab after David becomes king is one of the most striking reversals in the entire narrative. David became king, first over Judah, then over all Israel. He took Jerusalem. He built his palace. He received the covenant promise in the cedar house. He became the most powerful king in the region. The man who had unified the tribes and established the dynasty that God had promised would continue forever. And then he turned his attention to the surrounding nations. The text in 2 Samuel records what happened in the military campaigns that consolidated David's kingdom. And when it gets to Moab, it says something that stops the reader cold. He defeated Moab, and he made them lie down on the ground and measured them with a line, making them lie down in 2 lines to be put to death, and 1 full line to be spared. And Moab became servants to David and brought tribute. 2 lines to be put to death, 1 line to be spared. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was the execution of 2/3 of the Moabite prisoners of war, determined by the length of a measuring line laid across men lying face down on the ground. It was a method of killing that removed individual judgment from the process entirely. Your fate was not determined by what you had done or who you were. It was determined by where the line ended. The man who had sent his parents to Moab for safekeeping measured its men with a cord and killed 2/3 of them. How do we read this? The honest answer is that we read it with discomfort, because the text does not resolve the tension. It does not explain why David, whose family line included Ruth the Moabite, whose own parents had been sheltered by the king of Moab, would treat Moabite prisoners this way. The text records what happened and moves on. What we can say is this: the narrative places before us, without commentary, a man who carries Moabite memory in his family line, who trusted Moab with his parents' lives, who then became the king who measured Moabite men with a line and killed 2/3 of them. Whether David experienced any tension between these facts, the text does not say, but the narrative itself holds the tension in plain sight, placing the details close enough together that a careful reader cannot miss the collision between them. This is something the biblical text does repeatedly with David. It does not protect him from the contradictions in his story. It records them with the same flat documentary patience it uses for everything else. leaving the reader to sit with the weight of a man who could be capable of extraordinary loyalty and extraordinary violence, sometimes in relation to the same people. The Moab that sheltered his parents and the Moab that he measured with a cord were the same Moab. The king who trusted that Moab enough to send his family there and the king who killed 2/3 of its prisoners were the same king. Both things are true. And the story of David's relationship with Moab does not end with the military campaign. David's son, Solomon, who inherited the kingdom and built the temple that David had wanted to build, took many foreign wives. The text in 1 Kings names the nations these women came from. Moab is on the list. Solomon loved Moabite women, and they turned his heart after other gods, and specifically, the text says he built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. Stop and hold that for a moment. The son of the man who measured Moabite prisoners with a cord built a house for the god of Moab on the hill outside Jerusalem. The same hill. The same city that David had made the capital of everything he built. 3 generations. Ruth chose the God of Israel. David trusted Moab with his parents and then killed 2/3 of its men. Solomon built a sanctuary for the God his great-grandmother had left behind. The story of David's family and the story of Moab are not 2 stories running parallel to each other. They are one story, tangled together at every generation, refusing to separate into the clean categories that the law had tried to provide. Now we need to move to a moment that brings the military and the theological dimensions of Moab's relationship with Israel into their sharpest focus. A generation after David. In the time of his grandson's successor, Moab was under Israelite control, paying tribute. The king of Moab at this time was a man named Mesha, and Mesha was paying a tribute described with extraordinary specificity. He had to send the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. Every year, 100,000 lambs, 100,000 rams worth of wool. Then the king of Israel died. And Mesha, king of Moab, rebelled against the king of Israel. What happened next is one of the moments in the story of Moab where the biblical text and the archaeological record speak to each other in ways that change how we read both. Because Mesha did not only rebel, he recorded what happened. He carved it into a black stone. And that stone is the one we began this story with. Sitting in a museum in Jordan, speaking in the voice of a king who had his own version of every event the Bible describes from the other side of the border. We are now ready to go to that stone and hear what it says. We are ready to let Moab speak. Chapter 10. The Stone Speaks. Mesha's version. There is a moment in history when the other side gets to talk. It does not happen often. The ancient world has given us an enormous amount of material from the perspective of the victors, the conquerors, the people who controlled the scribes and the temples, and the record-keeping apparatus of civilization, the defeated, the subjugated, the people who lost the wars that determined whose story got told. They are almost always silent in the historical record, present as names in someone else's account, present as numbers in someone else's victory inscription, but rarely present in their own voice, telling their own version. Moab got to talk. The Mesha stele is a rounded slab of black basalt carved with 34 lines of text in the Moabite language. It was commissioned by a king named Mesha, son of Chemosh, and it was erected in a sanctuary at Dibon, the capital of Moab, sometime in the 9th century before Christ. It is the longest inscription in the Moabite language ever found. It is one of the most significant pieces of evidence for the history of the ancient Near East outside the biblical text, and it tells a story that sits in direct conversation with the account in the Bible, sometimes confirming it, sometimes complicating it, and sometimes simply offering a different angle on the same events that makes both accounts richer than either one is alone. Let us read what Mesha said. The inscription begins the way ancient royal inscriptions typically begin, with the king identifying himself and establishing his credentials. Mesha says he is the son of Chemosh, the king of Moab. He says his father was king over Moab for 30 years, and he himself became king after his father. He says he made this high place for Chemosh in Carcho because Chemosh saved him from all the kings, and because Chemosh made him look down on all his enemies. From the first lines, the theological framework is clear. Mesha is not telling a story about military strategy or political calculation. He is telling a story about what Chemosh did. Every victory is Chemosh's victory. Every piece of land recovered is land that Chemosh gave back. This is the same theological grammar that the Bible uses for Israel's military history. When Israel won, it was because God gave them the victory. When Moab won, it was because Chemosh gave them the victory. The logic was identical. The God was different. Now Mesha turns to the specific history he is recording. He says that Omri, king of Israel, had oppressed Moab for many days because Chemosh was angry with his land. Omri had indeed oppressed Moab. The biblical text confirms this. The tribute of 100,000 lambs and 100,000 rams worth of wool annually is the kind of tribute that only a genuinely subjugated people paid. Then Mesha says something that directly corresponds to what the Bible records about his rebellion. He says Chemosh said to him, "Go take Nebo against Israel." He says he went in the night and fought against it from the break of dawn until noon. He says he took it and slew all of them. 7,000 men and male sojourners, and women and female sojourners and maidservants. He says he devoted them to destruction for Ashtar Chemosh. He took a city. He killed everyone in it. Men, women, children, servants, and he dedicated the killing to his God. The Bible records what Mesha does not record with the same completeness. The biblical account of the campaign against Moab in 2 Kings 3 comes from the Israelite perspective and describes a coalition of Israel, Judah, and Edom marching against Moab. The coalition wins battle after battle. They destroy the cities. They cut down the trees. They stop up the springs. And Mesha was besieged in his last city. Then the text says something that has puzzled readers for centuries. When the king of Moab saw that the battle was going against him, he took his oldest son who was to reign in his place and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. He sacrificed his son on the wall of the city in full view of the attacking army. And there came great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. The text does not explain the great wrath. It does not say whose wrath it was or how it operated. It simply records that after Mesha burned his son on the wall, the coalition withdrew. The Mesha stele does not record this moment. It does not tell us what happened on the wall that day. But the stone does tell us something else that is significant. It tells us that Mesha won. The biblical text ends with the coalition withdrawing. The Mesha stele begins with Mesha in a position of having recovered his land and erected a monument to his victory. Whatever happened on that wall, the historical outcome was that Moab survived, and Mesha was able to commission a monument describing his accomplishments. Two texts, the same events, two different centers of gravity. The biblical account centers the question of Israel's faithfulness and God's response. The Mesha stele centers the question of Chemosh's faithfulness and Mesha's response. Both texts are asking the same fundamental question that every ancient Near Eastern society asked about military history. What does this outcome tell us about the relationship between our king, our God, and the forces arrayed against us? Now let us look at one specific line of the Mesha stele that has generated more scholarly discussion than almost any other. Line 31 of the inscription contains a phrase that some scholars read as a reference to the house of David. The text at that point is damaged and partially reconstructed from context. But what some scholars see in the surviving letters is a phrase that may include the words, "House of David." If that reading is correct, and scholars are genuinely divided on this point, then the Mesha stele contains one of the oldest non-biblical references to the Davidic dynasty in the entire archaeological record. It would mean that a Moabite king in the 9th century before Christ knew the name of David's house well enough to use it as a way of identifying the ruling dynasty of Israel. The man who measured Moabite prisoners with a cord and killed 2/3 of them. the man whose great-grandmother was Ruth the Moabite. That man's dynasty may have been named on a Moabite victory monument. David's name, possibly on Moab's stone. The two peoples, tangled together, even in the inscriptions they wrote to celebrate their independence from each other. Now let us return to the full arc of what the Mesha stele records, because it is more than a military account. Mesha records building projects. He built Karcho with its walls and its gates and its towers and the king's palace. He built roads. He built cities in the territory he had recovered. He settled his people in those cities. He is describing himself not only as a warrior but as a builder, as a king who recovered land and then made that land habitable, productive, worth living in. The inscription has the quality of a man who believes deeply that what he has done matters, that the cities he built and the roads he laid down and the territory he recovered were real accomplishments that deserved to be remembered. He believed they would be remembered. He carved them in stone. He placed the stone in a sanctuary. And then history moved on, as it always does. And the sanctuary fell, and the stone was buried, and the inscription waited in the ground east of the Dead Sea until a German missionary stood in a field in 1868 and looked at letters carved into black basalt and understood that he was looking at a voice from the other side of the border. 2,500 years. The stone waited 2,500 years. And when it came out of the ground, it was still saying what Mesha had carved into it, still identifying Chemosh as the one who had given the victory, still naming the cities that Mesha had built, still carrying the version of events that Moab wanted preserved. Now set the Mesha stele beside the account in 2 Kings 3 and hold both of them in view at the same time. From Israel's side, a coalition marched against Moab and won battle after battle, and something happened on the wall that caused them to withdraw. And the campaign ended without clear resolution. From Moab's side, Chemosh was angry and allowed Israel to oppress his people. And then Chemosh told his king to fight. And city after city was recovered. And the land was rebuilt. And a monument was erected to testify to what had happened. Which version is true? Both of them. Not in the sense that both contain equal amounts of historical accuracy about every detail, but in the sense that both are genuine attempts by genuine people to understand what had happened to them in terms that made sense within their framework for understanding the world. Israel read its history through the lens of covenant faithfulness and divine response. Moab read its history through the lens of Chemosh's anger and Chemosh's favor. Both peoples were doing the same thing that human beings have always done with history, looking for the pattern that explains why things happened the way they happened, and what it means for who they are, and what they should do next. The Mesha stele does not disprove the biblical account. The biblical account does not render the Mesha stele meaningless. They exist together. Two voices speaking about the same stretch of ancient history, from positions that are genuinely different and genuinely honest about what each side saw and believed and wanted to preserve. This is what it looks like when the other side gets to talk. Not a simple contradiction of the first account, not a revelation that makes everything that came before it false, but a complication, a deepening, a reminder that every event in history had people on both sides of it who woke up the next morning and had to make sense of what had happened, and who sometimes carved that sense-making into stone because they wanted it to last. Moab wanted to last. The stone was its way of insisting on that, and the stone did last. It lasted until the empires that came after Moab had long since crumbled. It lasted through the centuries when the Moabite language was no longer spoken, and the god Chemosh was no longer worshipped, and the kingdom of Moab was no longer a kingdom of anything except memory. The stone kept that version alive when everything else about Moab was gone. That is what stones are for. Chapter 11. The prophets turn their eyes east. There is a particular kind of attention that the biblical prophets gave to nations they considered enemies. It was not indifference. It was not the silence of people who had decided that what happened beyond their borders was someone else's concern. The great prophets of Israel, the men who stood in the streets of Jerusalem and the courts of kings and delivered words that cost them everything. They turned their eyes east with a regularity that is striking when you notice it. They looked at Moab, and what they said when they looked is one of the most theologically complex bodies of material in the entire prophetic tradition. Because it is not simply judgment. It is not simply a list of offenses and the punishments those offenses have earned. It is something more difficult and more honest than that. It is grief. Isaiah gave 2 full chapters to Moab. Chapters 15 and 16 of his book are called The Burden of Moab, and they begin with a description of Moab's destruction that is as vivid and immediate as anything in the prophetic literature. He says, Ar of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence in a night. He says, Kir of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence in a night. He describes Moab going up to its temples to weep. He describes the waters of Nimrim becoming a desolation. He describes the abundance they have gathered being carried away across the brook of the willows. He describes a people in flight, a people weeping, a people whose cities are gone and whose fields are burning and whose carefully accumulated wealth is being carried away by someone who has no interest in what it cost to build. And then Isaiah says something that has stopped readers in their tracks for thousands of years. He says his heart cries out for Moab. My heart cries out for Moab. The prophet, who has just described the destruction of Moab in precise and unsparing detail, turns and says his heart is breaking for the people he has just described being broken. He says his soul mourns for the men of Kir Hareseth. He says he weeps for them with the weeping of Jazer. He says, Therefore I weep with the weeping of Jazer for the vine of Sibmah. I drench you with my tears, O Heshbon and Elealeh. For over your summer fruit and your harvest the shout has ceased, and joy and gladness are taken away from the fruitful field. And in the vineyards no songs are sung, no cheers are raised, no treader treads out wine in the presses. I have put an end to the shouting. The image he chooses is the harvest, the end of the harvest songs, the silence where there used to be the sound of celebration and work, and the ordinary noise of a people alive in their land. Isaiah mourned the end of Moab's harvest. He did not explain why. He did not qualify it or walk it back or frame it as a diplomatic gesture. He simply said his heart cried out and his soul mourned, and he wept. The grammar is personal and immediate and without distance. A prophet of Israel wept for the enemy of Israel. Now let us ask why. Because the answer to that question reveals something important about the theological world these prophets were operating in. The prophets of Israel did not believe that God was only the God of Israel. They believed that the God of Israel was the God of all the earth, the creator of all peoples, the one whose purposes ran through all of history, and not only through the specific history of the covenant people. When they described the judgment of foreign nations, they were not describing the arbitrary punishment of peoples who had offended Israel. They were describing the movement of a God whose justice applied universally. And if God's justice applied universally, then God's grief at the consequences of that justice also applied universally. Isaiah wept for Moab because the God he spoke for was not indifferent to Moab's suffering, because the destruction of a people, any people, was not a cause for celebration in a theological world where every human being was a creature of the God who made them. Because the prophet who carried the burden of announcing judgment also carried the burden of feeling what that judgment cost, the burden of Moab. The word burden in that phrase is the Hebrew word masa, which means both a load that is carried and an oracle that is delivered. The prophetic burden was both the message and the weight of delivering it. Isaiah carried the announcement of Moab's destruction the way a person carries something heavy. Not easily. Not without feeling the weight in the body. My heart cries out for Moab. Now let us turn to Jeremiah, who devoted the longest oracle against any foreign nation in his entire book to Moab. Chapter 48 of Jeremiah is 57 verses long. It is a sustained meditation on what happens to a nation that has become too comfortable with itself, too confident in its own abundance, too settled into the assumption that what it has will continue to be. Jeremiah's description of Moab's failure is specific. He says Moab has been at ease from his youth and has settled on his dregs. He has not been emptied from vessel to vessel, nor has he gone into exile. So his taste remains in him, and his scent is not changed. The image is from winemaking, wine that is never poured from one vessel to another, never disturbed, never exposed to the process of refinement that comes from being moved and aerated, develops a residue at the bottom, dregs that make the taste bitter and cloudy. Jeremiah says Moab has been sitting undisturbed for so long that it has become its own kind of sediment, comfortable, unrefined, unable to see what the settled life has done to its character. He contrasts this with what Israel has experienced. Israel has been emptied from vessel to vessel. Israel has known exile and displacement, and the refinement that comes from being moved against your will through circumstances that strip away the comfortable assumptions. Moab has not, and the settled life, Jeremiah says, has produced a pride and an arrogance and a confidence in Chemosh that will not survive what is coming. Jeremiah describes the cities falling: Horonaim, Zor, Luhith, the sound of distress and anguish, the same geography, the same sense of a land being unmade. And then, buried in the middle of all that unmaking, a verse that most people read past without stopping: "Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days, declares the Lord." Read that again. In the middle of 57 verses of judgment, after the cities have fallen and the pride has been broken, and Chemosh has been put to shame, and the treader treads no more, and the shouting has ceased, "Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days." It is not a conditional promise attached to requirements. It is not preceded by if. It is a declaration, attributed directly to the Lord, coming after everything that has been said about what Moab deserves. And at the end of it, almost as if the prophet himself was surprised by what he was compelled to say, there is a word of future restoration. The same God who judged Moab would restore Moab. The same voice that announced the falling of the cities announced a future in which the fortunes would be turned. Now let us add Ezekiel to the picture, because his oracle against Moab in chapter 25 is brief compared to Isaiah and Jeremiah, but theologically pointed. Ezekiel records God saying that Moab said, "The house of Judah is like all the other nations." That was Moab's offense in Ezekiel's accounting. Not a military campaign or a hired prophet or a refusal of bread and water. The offense was an interpretation. Moab had looked at the rubble of Jerusalem and reached a conclusion. The God of Israel had not protected his people. Israel was ordinary. The covenant was an illusion. And in a world where theology and military power were the same category, that conclusion was its own kind of weapon. When Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and carried Judah into exile, Moab looked at the devastation and said, "See, the house of Judah is like all the other nations." The specialness of the covenant, the distinctness of Israel's relationship with its God, had been demonstrated to be an illusion. Ezekiel records God responding to this with the declaration that Moab's flank would be exposed, and its cities opened, and the people given to the people of the east. But notice what Moab's claim was actually doing. Moab was not simply being petty about a rival's misfortune. Moab was asking a question that the fall of Jerusalem genuinely raised. If the God of Israel was the God of all the earth, if the covenant was real, then how do you account for Babylon? How do you account for the temple burning and the king being blinded and the people being marched into exile? Moab asked the question that Israel itself was wrestling with in the books written during and after the exile. Moab looked at the destruction and said ordinary. Israel looked at the same destruction and wrote Lamentations, wrote the Psalms of exile, wrote Jeremiah and Ezekiel themselves. Both responses were honest responses to the same event. Moab's response was judged. Israel's response was preserved. Now step back and hold all three prophets in view at the same time. Isaiah weeps for Moab while announcing its destruction. He carries the burden of the oracle in his body and cannot deliver it without grief. Jeremiah describes Moab's settled arrogance and the coming devastation in 57 verses. And then, at the end, says, "Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days." Ezekiel records Moab's theological claim that Israel was ordinary and announces judgment on the claim. 3 prophets, 3 different angles on the same nation, 3 different emphases, and what emerges from holding them together is a picture of Moab that is more complicated than either pure enemy or pure outsider. Moab is a nation that matters enough to grieve, a nation whose arrogance is specific enough to diagnose, a nation whose theological claims are important enough to correct, a nation whose judgment is thorough enough to describe in detail, and whose future is, astonishingly, not permanently closed. Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days. The prophets who saw the destruction of Moab most clearly also saw, or were given to say, something beyond the destruction, something that resisted the finality that the destruction seemed to demand. The God who refused to let Balaam curse Israel apparently also refused to let the destruction of Moab be the last word about Moab, the nation that the law excluded to the 10th generation and forever, the nation whose king hired a prophet who could not curse, the nation whose woman crossed the line and became the great-grandmother of David, the nation whose stone spoke back from the other side of the border. That nation, at the end of the prophetic tradition's engagement with it, received a word of restoration, small, almost hidden in the middle of a long oracle of judgment, easy to read past if you are moving quickly through the text. But there, "Yet I will restore." The same God who judges is the same God who restores. And Moab, of all the nations the prophets addressed, is one of the few to receive that word explicitly, buried in the judgment but unmistakably present. The enemy God refused to erase. Even in the prophetic literature, even in the oracles of destruction, still there, still not fully gone. Chapter 12. The Fall of a Kingdom. Everything ends. Not metaphorically, not in the soft way that people mean when they say, "Nothing lasts forever," and intend it as a comfort rather than a fact. Everything ends in the hard, specific, historical sense that cities fall and languages die, and the people who built the temples and carved the inscriptions and raised their children on a plateau above the Dead Sea eventually stop doing all of those things. Not because they chose to stop, but because the world they inhabited was dismantled around them by forces larger than anything they could have organized against. Moab ended. The ending did not come all at once. It came the way most endings come, gradually and then suddenly, through a series of pressures that accumulated over generations until the structure they were pressing against could no longer hold its shape. To understand how Moab ended, you have to understand the world that was forming around it in the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ. The ancient Near East was being reorganized by empires of a scale that the region had not previously experienced. Not kingdoms competing with kingdoms on roughly equal terms, which was the world that Moab and Israel and Edom and Ammon had inhabited for centuries. Something different. Something that operated at a scale that made the old calculations irrelevant. Assyria had already demonstrated what this new scale looked like. The Assyrian campaigns of the 8th century had carried entire populations away from their lands and replaced them with settlers from other conquered regions. This was not simply military defeat. It was the deliberate destruction of the conditions that made a people a people. It was cultural annihilation executed as state policy. The northern kingdom of Israel had experienced this. The 10 tribes carried away by Assyria. The population replaced. The identity dissolved into the larger Assyrian imperial project. What had been a kingdom became a province, became an ethnic memory. Moab watched this happen to its neighbors. The Moabites appear in Assyrian records as a vassal state during this period, paying tribute to the Assyrian kings. Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib. The names appear in Assyrian annals with Moabite kings listed among those who brought gifts and submitted to the imperial power from the north. This was survival of a kind. Not the survival of independence, but the survival of existence. The choice to remain by paying whatever was required to remain. But Assyria fell. In 612 before Christ, the city of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, was destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. The empire that had reorganized the ancient Near East collapsed with a speed that astonished the peoples who had lived under its shadow for generations. And into the space that Assyria had occupied stepped Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar II was the king who brought the remaining kingdoms of the ancient Near East under Babylonian control, with a thoroughness that left almost nothing standing independently. He destroyed Jerusalem in 586 before Christ. He burned the temple that Solomon had built. He carried the survivors of Judah's leadership class into exile in Babylon. What he did to Moab is less completely documented, because the biblical writers who recorded this period were naturally more focused on what happened to Israel than what happened to its eastern neighbor. But the archaeological and historical evidence is consistent and clear. Moab did not survive the Babylonian period as an independent kingdom. The archaeological record for Moabite material culture, the pottery, the inscriptional tradition, the evidence of a specific people maintaining a specific identity in a specific place, fades from view in the late 7th century before Christ. This does not mean Moab's population was killed or carried away entirely. The picture is more complicated than that, and the evidence does not allow confident specifics. What it does allow us to say is this: by the time the Babylonian period had passed, Moab as a distinct political and cultural entity had effectively ended. Some Moabites were likely carried into Babylonian exile. Others were displaced by groups moving into the plateau from the south and east, including Arabian tribes who expanded into the region during this period. Others remained on the land, but under conditions that did not allow the maintenance of a distinct Moabite political and cultural identity. The Moabite language stopped being written. The sanctuaries of Chemosh stopped functioning as the center of a national religious identity. The royal institution that had produced Mesha and his stone disappeared. The plateau east of the Dead Sea was still there. The fields were still fertile. The trade routes still ran through the region. But the people who worked those fields and traveled those routes were no longer, in any meaningful political or cultural sense, Moabites. The prophet Jeremiah had said something about this process that reads, in retrospect, with a precision that is striking. He had described the cities falling and the pride being broken and Chemosh being put to shame. And he had used the language of weeping that Isaiah had used before him. The language of a prophet who cannot announce destruction without feeling it in his body. He wept for the harvest songs that would not be sung. He wept for the treader who would tread no more in the wine presses. He wept for the shouting that had ceased. These are the images of ordinary life, not the destruction of armies or the fall of great monuments. The end of harvest songs. The silence where there used to be the sound of celebration and work and the ordinary noise of a people alive in their land. That is what the end of Moab looked like from the inside. If you were a Moabite farmer on the plateau in the decades when the empire was pressing in from every direction, and the world that had always organized itself around Chemosh and the king and the seasonal rhythms of grain and cattle was coming apart at the seams, the harvest songs stopped. And that silence is one of the saddest things in the entire story. Not because Moab was a great empire whose fall reshapes the world, but because Moab was a small kingdom of ordinary people who planted and harvested and worshipped and built and raised their children on a plateau above the Dead Sea. And all of that ordinary life simply stopped. 3 things remained. The Mesha stele, buried in the ground outside the ruined city of Dibon, waiting in the dark for 2,500 years, still saying what Mesha had carved into it, still carrying the version of events that Moab wanted preserved. The name Moab in the biblical text, appearing across more than 1,000 years of narrative, In the laws and the histories and the prophetic literature and the genealogies, never quite leaving. And the woman, Ruth, whose decision on a road between Moab and Bethlehem inserted Moabite identity into the center of the narrative that would eventually produce David and everything that followed from David. 3 forms of preservation. Each did what it could do. The stone preserved the memory of what the kingdom had been. The text preserved Moab as a name that the tradition refused to stop using. The woman inserted Moabite identity into the center of a story that would keep being told long after the kingdom had disappeared. None of them saved the kingdom. But together, they saved something the kingdom could not save for itself. The question. Chapter 13. What the stone could not save. There is a difference between being remembered and being saved. The Mesha stele remembered Moab. It preserved the name of the king, the name of the god, the names of the cities, the version of events that Moab wanted carved into permanence before the world moved on. It did everything that a monument is designed to do. It lasted. It endured. It came out of the ground 2,500 years after the hands that carved it had turned to dust, still saying what those hands had wanted it to say. But it did not save Moab. The stone preserved the memory of a kingdom that no longer existed. It kept the words alive after the language that produced those words had stopped being spoken. It carried the theological claim that Chemosh had given the victory long after the sanctuaries of Chemosh had fallen silent. The stone remembered. The stone could not save. This distinction matters because the story of Moab is partly a story about what different kinds of preservation look like and what they can and cannot do. The stone preserved the Moabite version of events. It could not preserve the Moabite kingdom. The text preserved Moab as a name and a presence in the larger story. It could not preserve Moab as an independent nation with its own language and its own god and its own king. The woman could insert Moabite identity into the bloodline of kings and into the genealogy of the one Matthew called the Son of David. She could not reverse the judgment that the prophets had announced or prevent the fall that the empires had delivered. Each form of preservation did what it could do and could not do what it could not do. And what remains, when you hold all 3 together, is something that defies the simple categories of victory and defeat. Inclusion and exclusion. Insider and outsider. Moab is gone, and Moab is still here. The kingdom is gone. The language is gone. The god Chemosh is gone in the sense that no one worships him, and no community maintains the traditions that the sanctuaries at Dibon once maintained. The political entity that produced Balak and Mesha, and the 100,000 lambs of annual tribute, and the measuring line laid across men on the ground. That is gone. And yet, Moab's name is in the law that shaped Jewish identity for centuries. Moab's name is in the genealogy that Matthew compiled to introduce the figure around whom he was building his entire account. Moab's name is in the prophetic literature that formed the theological imagination of communities that read those texts as scripture. Moab's name is in the book that billions of people have read in hundreds of languages across more than 2,000 years. Moab is more present in the text than most kingdoms that lasted far longer and accomplished far more by conventional historical measures. Why? Part of the answer is geographical. Moab was next door. The proximity that made Moab dangerous, the proximity that the law was partly designed to manage, is also the proximity that made Moab impossible to ignore. You cannot write the history of Israel without writing the history of what was on the other side of the Dead Sea. Part of the answer is genealogical. Ruth's decision on the road inserted Moab into the family tree in a way that could not be removed. You cannot tell where David came from without saying the name of the people Ruth came from. But there is a third part of the answer that is harder to articulate and more theologically significant than the first 2. The story of Moab kept being told because it kept asking a question that the tradition could not answer and therefore could not stop engaging. The question of who belongs. It is one of the oldest and most persistent questions in religious life. Who is inside and who is outside? Who has access to the sacred and who is excluded from it? Who counts as part of the community and who is a stranger at the gate? Israel's tradition had a clear legal answer to the question of Moab's belonging. 10 generations. Forever. The assembly of the Lord. Not entered. And then Ruth walked into Bethlehem, and the legal answer was not sufficient to contain what she represented. Not because the law was wrong to exist. The law had reasons. Real reasons. Peor had happened. Balak had happened. The bread and water had not been offered on the road. The law was a response to genuine historical experience. A genuine threat. A genuine catastrophe. But Ruth was also a genuine historical experience. A genuine act. A genuine reality that the law had not been designed to account for. And the tradition preserved both. The law that excluded, and the story of the woman who crossed the line that the law had drawn. Both things in the same text. Both things held without resolution. This is one of the places where the biblical tradition is most honest about the tension at the center of its own claims. It does not pretend that the law and the story are easily reconcilable. It does not offer a tidy theological principle that explains how Ruth's belonging and the Deuteronomy 23 exclusion fit together without remainder. It puts both before you and trusts you to sit with the weight of the question they together generate. What do you do when the one the law excludes is the one who most embodies what the law was trying to protect? The tradition's answer was not to resolve the tension. Its answer was to preserve it, to keep both the law and the story in the same text, available to every subsequent generation that would have to work out its own relationship to the question of who belongs and what belonging costs. That preservation is itself a kind of theological statement. A tradition that keeps the question alive rather than answering it too quickly is a tradition that understands something important about the nature of the question. That it is the kind of question that cannot be answered once and then set aside. That it has to be answered again and again, in each new situation, by people who have inherited both the law and the story and have to figure out what to do with both of them. Moab forced that question on Israel. And Israel, to its credit, did not erase Moab from the text in order to make the question easier to avoid. Jeremiah's word sits at the end of 57 verses of judgment, like a sentence the prophet himself seems surprised to be saying. Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days, declares the Lord. What does it mean to restore the fortunes of a people who no longer exist as a people? The honest answer is that we do not know. Scholars have read this in different ways. Some see it as a conditional promise never fulfilled. Some see it as a rhetorical move within the prophetic tradition. Some see it as pointing towards something beyond the immediate historical situation. What is clear is that Jeremiah felt compelled to say it. The same voice that had delivered 57 verses of detailed judgment felt compelled to add, at the end yet, that single word, carrying a weight disproportionate to its size, sitting at the end of the judgment the way a door sits at the end of a wall, not canceling the wall, not pretending the wall was not there, but providing something the wall alone did not provide. A way through. The God who judged Moab said yet. The God who refused to let Balaam curse Israel also refused. Apparently, to let judgment be the absolute final word about the people Balaam had failed to curse. Moab. The name the Bible keeps saying. Long after the kingdom that bore the name had stopped existing. Long after the God that the kingdom worshipped had stopped being worshipped. Long after the language in which the king had carved his monument had stopped being spoken. Still in the text, still in the law, still in the genealogy, still in the question that the tradition refused to stop asking about who belongs and what belonging means, and what you do with the people who are close enough to be kin and far enough to be strangers and present enough in your story that you cannot tell your story without them. The stone at Dibon preserved Moab's version of events. The stone could not save the kingdom. But something else saved Moab from the kind of erasure that befalls most small ancient kingdoms that fall to larger empires and leave behind nothing but a layer of ash in the archaeological record. What saved Moab from that kind of erasure was the refusal of the story to let it be erased. A refusal that came, ultimately, from the same source that Jeremiah had attributed his yet to, the God who judges, who also restores, who also, apparently, remembers even the enemy, especially the enemy who was never quite only an enemy. Chapter 14. The Enemy in the Bloodline. Matthew begins his account with a list. It is not a dramatic opening. It does not begin with a scene or a speech or a moment of crisis. It begins with names. A chain of names running from Abraham to David to the Babylonian exile to a man named Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. 42 generations, organized into 3 groups of 14, a structure that Matthew built deliberately, using the numerical value of the Hebrew letters in David's name as the organizing principle. He was not simply recording genealogical data. He was making a theological argument through the form of the list itself. And in the middle of that carefully constructed argument, Matthew did something he did not have to do. He named women. Ancient genealogies in the Jewish tradition typically traced the male line, father to son, generation to generation. Women appeared in these records when they were necessary to explain something about the lineage, but they were not typically highlighted, not named individually as significant in the way that Matthew names these 5. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah, Mary, 5 women, each one carrying a story that complicates the smooth transmission of a lineage that is supposed to be about promise and faithfulness and the progressive fulfillment of covenant commitment. Matthew included all 5 of them. In a genealogy that did not require him to include any of them, he names her Ruth. Just Ruth. But every reader who knew her story knew the identifier that the book of Ruth never lets anyone forget. Ruth the Moabite. Matthew did not need to write the word. The name itself carried it. In a genealogy built on names, some names arrive with their full history already attached. And that history includes everything. The cave above Zoar, the law that excluded her people to the 10th generation and forever, the king who hired a prophet who could not curse, the boundary at Peor that broke, the measuring line that David laid across Moabite prisoners, the stone in the ground at Dibon, the harvest songs that stopped. All of it arrives with the name Ruth. Matthew was a Jewish man writing for a Jewish audience, an audience that knew the law, that knew what Deuteronomy 23 said, that felt immediately what it meant that this name was in this list. He kept it anyway, not as a scandal to be managed or a complication to be minimized, as a fact to be stated and left to do its own work in the mind of the reader. Now let us think about what it means for the enemy to be in the bloodline. Not in a peripheral way, not as a distant ancestor several dozen generations back, so remote that the connection is genealogically real but experientially meaningless. Ruth was David's great-grandmother. She was 3 generations from David, close enough that the tradition remembered not only her name but her story. Not only her existence, but the specific words she had spoken on a road between Moab and Bethlehem. David carried those words in his family memory. The tradition that produced David carried them in its literary memory. And Matthew, writing the genealogy that would introduce the figure around whom his entire account was organized, preserved them by preserving her name in the list. The Moabite woman who crossed the line was 3 generations from the king. The Moabite woman who crossed the line was in the bloodline of the one Matthew called the son of David in the very first line of his account. She was there, not because someone had forgotten to remove her, or because the tradition had not noticed the complication she represented. She was there because the tradition had looked at the complication and decided, apparently, that the complication was essential, that the story of where this person came from was incomplete without the name of the woman from Moab who had chosen faithfulness when no one required her to choose it. Now let us return to the black stone one final time. The Mesha, Steel, and Ruth are not usually placed in conversation with each other. They belong to different genres, different time periods, different kinds of historical evidence. One is an archaeological artifact, a royal inscription commissioned to celebrate military victory and carved in stone to last. The other is a narrative, a story about ordinary people in a time of famine and grief, and the specific kind of faithfulness that does not announce itself with monuments. But they are both Moab, the stone and the woman, the king and the gleaner, the victory inscription and the decision made on a road, Chemosh and the God of Israel, the voice that spoke from the other side of the border and the voice that said, "Where you go, I will go." Both of them are Moab, and the story that contains both of them is more honest about what Moab was than either one alone could be. Hold all of that together, and you have something that resists the simple categories that human beings prefer when they are trying to organize the world into manageable pieces. A nation that was neither simply inside nor simply outside, neither simply the enemy nor simply the kin, never fully erased from the story even by the forces that erased it from the map. You have three pieces of evidence that the tradition preserved for every subsequent generation to work with. The law that said Moab did not belong, written in Deuteronomy, preserved in the canon, still there. The woman who demonstrated that belonging was possible in ways the law had not accounted for, written in Ruth, preserved in the canon, still there. The word yet, written in Jeremiah, preserved in the canon, still there. Three pieces of evidence. No verdict. Just the evidence and the question and the long history of a people trying to figure out what to do with both. This is what it means for the enemy to be in the bloodline. Not that the enmity was erased. The law was not repealed. The history of conflict and exploitation and hired prophets and measuring lines laid across prisoners was not forgotten. The prophets who announced Moab's judgment were not wrong about what they saw. But the enmity was complicated. By proximity, by kinship, by the specific act of one woman on one road, who chose something that the law had not required and the tradition could not stop talking about. And the complication is itself the theological statement that the tradition has been building toward across the entire arc of Moab's presence. And God refused to erase Moab, not because Moab deserved to be preserved. The judgment was real. The fall of the kingdom was real. The silence of the harvest songs on the plateau was real. But because the story that God was telling through the history of these peoples was larger than what any single category could contain. Larger than enemy. Larger than outsider. Larger than the law's carefully maintained boundary. The story was already somewhere else. In a field in Bethlehem, in the words spoken on a road, in the name written without apology into a genealogy by a Jewish writer who understood that where a person comes from is part of who that person is. Ruth, a Moabite woman whose origin was a cave and whose destiny was the family line of a king, whose people were excluded from the assembly and whose great-grandson built the assembly's most sacred house, whose God had been Chemosh, and who chose the God of Israel, and who the tradition remembered as having made that choice with the fullness of a decision that knew exactly what it was giving up and chose anyway. The enemy in the bloodline. Still there. Still not erased. Still named. And the stone in the museum in Jordan, still saying what Mesha carved into it. Still the voice from the other side of the border. Speaking in a language that stopped being spoken long ago. About victories that were real and cities that were real, and a king who believed that what Chemosh had done deserved to be remembered in permanence. The stone and the woman, both of them Moab, both of them still present, neither one erased. Because the God who tells this story apparently decided, somewhere in the long arc of a history that stretches from a cave above Zoar to a field in Bethlehem to a list of names in a Jewish writer's account of where one particular person came from. That Moab was part of the story. Not a footnote. Not a cautionary tale filed away under enemy and closed. Part of the story. The enemy God refused to erase. Still there. In the law, and in the genealogy, and in the prophetic literature, and in the word yet that Jeremiah could not stop himself from saying, still there. In the black stone and the barley field and the road between Moab and Bethlehem, and the words a woman spoke to an old widow who told her to go back. Where you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. She said it on a road between Moab and Bethlehem, 3,000 years ago. People are still saying it.